Welcome to the webinar on the Open Data Rural Gap. My name is Elina Linkton-Arians, and I'm joined here by my colleagues Soraya Janssen and Gianfranco Ciccone from the European Data Portal. I won't spend much time introducing what the European Data Portal is, as that's not the point of this webinar. Instead, I would like to give the floor to my speaker shortly. Introducing our speakers. So we have Dr. Gefjon Thurmer. I invite her to correct me in how I pronounce her name. She's a research associate at King's College London and completed her PhD in website at the University in Southampton. Her thesis was on the effects of online participation processes. She subsequently worked also on the data pitch project at the University of Southampton, where she wrote about the key lessons learned from the experience of data sharing, most notably a toolkit for data sharing. She currently works on the project Action, overseeing the development of a toolkit for citizen scientists. She has published on the usage and sharing data in different contexts. We also have Johanna Walker, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Southampton. Her research was on open data and innovation, and she works on the Interreg 2C's project Smart City Innovation Framework implementation. She has researched many areas of open data, including data literacy and how to measure open data, and authorized analytical reports to the European Data Portal on portal sustainability and entrepreneurship and open data. She became interested in the concept of rural open data as its own area of study after spending a week researching the digital aspect of Scottish Island with no mobile signal and almost no broadcast access. We then have two more speakers. One is Jos Bergvins, a strategic consultant at the municipal of Barneveld in the Netherlands, to the Poultry Expertise Center and the Regio Food Valley. In these roles, Jos is responsible for public affairs and international cooperation, especially in representing the municipality to the EU. Last year, he worked on international cooperation in the field of consumer involvement in the agro-food production, a partnership between Regio Valley and the Östergötland region in Sweden, to name a few. Last but not least is Daniel Worth, the research and performance analyst for the Rural Service Network in England. He has worked for the RSN for about 10 years, and in this time, he has used his experience within private, public, and voluntary sectors to contribute to the development of the service to member organizations, with a particular focus on the use of data to convey the rural perspective. That's a very long-winded introduction to our speakers, but I won't waste any time and will now give them the floor.
Thank you, Elina. Thank you for that introduction. What I'm going to talk about first, and Alina's going to drive, so if you want to go to the first slide, that would be great. So I'm going to talk about why we decided to investigate smart rural as an area of its own interest. And our starting point for this research, ironically enough, was smart cities. So smart cities and open data have become closely entwined, and this focus on cities for data makes huge sense. They have dense populations that can be reached comparatively easily. Infrastructural changes in smaller geographical areas can have substantial impact. And in many countries, such as Spain, Cyprus, and Malta, reaching the urban population effectively means reaching 50% of the entire population. But what do smart cities imply for the 27% of EU citizens who live in rural or non-urban areas? While many densely populated EU member states have a very high proportion of citizens living in urban areas, the opposite is true, especially in most Central and Eastern European countries. However, and this surprises a lot of people, even in more Western states such as Ireland and France, over a third of citizens live in rural areas. If you take the paradigm of smart cities and try and transpose those urban practices to a rural setting, there are challenges. Even though that's something that has been tried, people have tried to apply, it's not always been entirely successful. With some of the key areas of smart city investment, such as those to do with traffic and parking management and multimodal transport, are far less applicable in rural settings. there are comparisons between rural populations and urban populations that mean that solutions for urban populations are just not going to work so well in rural settings. According to the Rural Open Data Project, which is one of the few projects actually looking at it, it's a Canadian project, few, if any, rural local governments provide open data, and little is known about how open data, is the important part, affects rural communities. If there's a benefit, they say, to the communities from open data policies, it's likely that rural communities are benefiting less than urban ones, if at all. So this is the urban-rural divide that we've most likely heard of in other contexts, but the existing research suggests it's likely to be present in the open data context as well. So our previous research, and that's another aspect that brought us to this research, was that various dimensions of data that are most prized, such as volume, were less likely to be available in the rural population context. Managing small data sets also meant that aspects such as granularity were likely to be reduced. For instance, data from multiple Scottish islands being compiled as a single data set, making it harder to unearth the data for one single island. And finally, we noticed as we started to do the research that research on improving the digital offering for rural areas, which often looked at something like broadband provision or rural digital hubs, usually neglected data. So they didn't really look at the benefits of data provision or access for rural areas. And there's more examples of how the rural and urban challenges differ across sectors, including transport, as I already mentioned, but also health and aging, housing, supply chains, education, and employment. You can find that in the report. So moving on to the next slide. Our first challenge when we were writing this report was defining rural. I think that's, there we go. So we needed to refocus the research by defining the topic of interest, and rural is a surprisingly hard concept to define. It's often just described as non-urban. Describing something by what it isn't is not that helpful when you're trying to research it. So in the EU, a degree of urbanisation classification was created in 2014, which defines 3 types of areas: densely, intermediate, and thinly populated areas. So this was created to develop several similar but not identical spatial concepts, and is based on the population grid. However, population is only one way to define rural. There's others that include, as you can see here, the level of impervious surfaces, that's how much of the area the land is built on, and intensity of light at night, which is taken as, again, signalling there being built up area and an intensity of electricity. So if you look at those kinds of things, it gives you a geographical focus. It says, okay, we're going to look at these thinly populated areas, but it doesn't necessarily clarify what you should look at within that area. So we took an old school approach at this point, and we consulted a dictionary. And Merriam-Webster told us that rural was pertaining to the countryside, those that live in the countryside, or agriculture. So in other words, this suggested to us that it was about 2 things. It was about the people who lived in the countryside and the industry and activities of the countryside, which we call the rural economy. In the rural economy, there's actually an activity we don't cover, which is tourism, which we'll hear a little bit more about later, I think. But we focused on those that pertain to the land, or indeed the sea, and which are not possible on the same scale or at all in urban areas. So for instance, agriculture covers 47% of the EU territory and around 40% of the EU budget. Forestry accounts for 1% of total EU GDP, and it's also important culturally. So looking at the data availability for these, we consider to be really important areas. Moving on to the next slide, please, Alina. Thank you. So the full paper, which contains all the references for anything I've mentioned, looks at 4 things: the availability and reuse of open data about rural populations, and the availability and reuse of open data about the rural economy. Today, Jos and Daniel will be giving their hands-on insight into the reuse of open data. So Geffion and I will talk about our findings regarding the availability of rural open data. And we'll then return after we've heard from Jos and Daniel to sum up the recommendations of the report. So our research had both a quantitative and qualitative element. I'll talk through the results of our interviews, and Geffian will present our statistical research. We found 5 factors that affected the availability of rural population data. You can see them here. They are the level of digitisation, the awareness of open data, IT capacity, the usefulness of open data, and standardisation. So taking the first of these, the level of digitisation is simply that. Many rural administrations are working with analogue tools, often sheets of paper. They are maybe pre-database. Data sets may still be collected on paper, and at best, they might be published as PDFs. For our IT capacity point, I'm sure you can see this is a picture of a typical rural server rack, and our interviewees in both Southern and Northern Europe reported that some local authorities had no IT department of any kind, and so had no capacity to manage data. Initiatives we found included piggybacking on the IT of larger or nearby urban authorities, and simply getting lucky with motivated employees. There appears to be far less institutionalization of open data culture or practices. Awareness of open data varies, according to what we found, both amongst publishers and potential users. The more urban member states do tend to have a higher awareness of open data. In situations, finally, such as Romania, we have big standardization issues. So the central government in Romania receives data from 3,000 local authorities in a variety of formats. So this is a huge undertaking to standardize the data for publication. And our final point here, usefulness, has several dimensions. Given the challenges above, data is not, you will be shocked to hear, necessarily open because it is perceived to be the most useful. It's often done on a low-hanging fruit basis. Other publication practices that affect availability are generally structured around data sets being considered too small to be useful and therefore compiled or not published. And Roscommon in Ireland, which we have a case study on in the report, has been an interesting and illuminating exception to this. I'm now going to hand over to Geffian to talk about some statistical insight we had on this.
Thank you, Jana. If we could move to the next slide. So some of what Johanna has just talked about probably sounds familiar to many of you. I've certainly seen some nodding for the people with videos. There's, publishing low-hanging fruit data sets, institutionalizing practices, raising awareness are all issues that are common in emerging states of open data culture. And that, combined with our interviews and insights from those, we hypothesized that potentially more rural states simply have a lower open data maturity. They just haven't caught up yet. So we've investigated this statistically, and what you see on this chart is the percentage of rural population, one of the measurements of measuring of rurality, versus the open data maturity. And what you can hopefully see is that you can't see a correlation because there isn't one. There is a very, very weak correlation, actually the other way around, where countries with higher rural population have a higher open data maturity, but there is no, it's so minuscule that it's effectively non-existent. So that hypothesis that more rural states have lower open data maturity is incorrect. If we can move on to the next slide. We continued from there looking at who publishes the data, how available is it? What you see here on the left-hand side is the share of data sets that are published in the EDP by country, a total of over 800,000. And the more red it is, the more data is published. Now on the right-hand side, you see the data published in agriculture. And you can already see that there's some overlap, but some surprising outliers. to start with, 90% of the data on agriculture is published by Germany, Poland, and France. Of the entire 70,000 data sets, 90% of those come only from these three countries. Now, these three countries aren't particularly rural. And we go into more detail on this in the report. But we looked at the correlation between GDP coming from agriculture and data sets published. And again, there is none. It seems that the data that is published is apparently published more opportunistic, not just strategic. It's not linked to how rural the countries are. It's not linked to the open data maturity per se. And it's just very inconsistent between the relative value that agriculture has to a country and the data they publish about it. If we move on one slide further, thank you. So this is a bit of an eye chart, and I'm aware of that, but it just summarizes the entirety of what we found. So the blue and the orange bar chart is the data published on the EDP. So you can see that the Czech Republic has by far published the most data, but they haven't really published anything on agriculture. Germany, next up, published far less, but a large chunk of that is agriculture. The green dots are the open data maturity. The purple dots are the percentage of rural population, and the red triangles are the percentage of GDP that comes from agriculture. And again, what you can see is that there isn't really any insight to be gained from this, apart from there is no correlation. It's not the rurality of the population. It's not the percentage of agriculture. It's not the open data maturity. So we have to look at the context, and we have to look at other factors to explain this rural data gap. And with that, I hand back to Joanna.
Thank you very much, Gefion. So we investigated these issues further in our interviews. And many of the issues we found in rural population data certainly still apply to the rural economy data regarding capacity, digitalization, and low-hanging fruit. However, we also discovered more. So one of that was publication issues. Data sets might in fact be published on the Ministry of Agricultural site or the Forestry Ministry site, but then not on the national portal. That this potentially affects its ability to be found can be shown by the fact that it then won't be picked up by the EDP. So it is a lot less likely to be picked up by somebody who's coming along and trying to find it. The data might be nominally open, but only available on request, which requires knowing that it exists, knowing who to request it from, and makes it quite a complicated process. And of course, a lack of reusable formats where we have the data in PDF format. Investigating phishing, we found that data hoarding, unclear licensing, and a lack of incentives still prevail. On the other hand, we did find that some of the most advanced data portals are found in forestry. We also came across an interesting concept about urban drivers of rural open data. So this is my picture of my Greek fisherman here, who, as our Irish respondent said, he suggested that they weren't sitting in their boat wondering how they could use open data to improve their lives. He said there's few fishermen sitting in their boat thinking of a way to use open data. So that creates a gap between the rural industries and the audience that might benefit from the use of open data and those who are working with open data. However, an audience that is located rurally and both creates and consumes a vast amount of data is farmers and agriculture. And I'm now going to hand over to Jos from Regio Food Valley to offer some insight about that data. Thank you.